Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Building Power Grassroots Education Advocacy with me, your host, Zakiya Sankara-Jabar. Thank you all for your patience with our technical difficulties. We're excited to get started here with you all this afternoon, early afternoon. Today, I'm delighted to welcome a good friend of mine, Jeff Canady, who is a lifelong resident of Washington, D.C., and a 30-year educator in the D.C. public schools. I'm actually going to take the time to read his full bio because I think that is critically important to help inform the conversation that we're going to have with Brother Jeff this evening or this afternoon. So Jeff is a Washington, D.C. native who attended Frank Ballou High School and McKinley Technical High School. Jeff graduated from East Carolina University, where he was awarded 2 of the nation's top journalism prizes from the Associated College Press in 1986. He was in the first East Carolina University student to win this prestigious prize. Upon his return to Washington, D.C., Jeff worked tirelessly as a roving leader in one of Washington's most dangerous neighborhoods at the height of the crack epidemic in the mid-1980s. Jeff served as a legislative assistant to respected D.C. Council member Wilhelmina Rolark of the D.C. City Council. As legislative assistant, he advanced the council's agenda in public education, public services, and various crucial health-related legislation in the city, rife with health disparities, which certainly disproportionately impacted underserved and marginalized communities in D.C. In 1991, Jeff left the city council and became a public school teacher in marginalized D.C. East of the river. During this time and early in his promising teaching career, Harvard University's highly regarded Project Zero, an initiative to understand and enhance learning in the arts and other disciplines, recognized Jeff as one of the nation's best K-12 teachers in the United States. In 1996, the D.C. City Council nominated Jeff to the Emergency D.C. Control Board, which is the District of Columbia's Financial Responsibility and Management Assistance Authority, where he worked to advance the interests of D.C. public schools. So in 1998, the Washington Post and D.C. City Paper strongly endorsed Jeff as a candidate for the D.C. School Board. In 1998, Jeff continued his love for lifelong learning by earning a master's in education from Trinity University in D.C., and he attended the Howard University Divinity School and the Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Currently, Jeff works as a national education legislation issue serving as a political director of United Opt Out, which is a focus on the national No Child Left Behind legislation and Every Student Succeeds Act. And in 2016, Jeff's progressive radio broadcast and assertive vocal advocacy on behalf of the district's vulnerable school-age population resulted in Washington, D.C. creating one of the most transformative lead water laws in the nation to protect children in schools, recreation, and community centers and other places where children congregate regularly. His recent $3 million arbitration award is the largest settlement ever in the D.C. School district arbitration matter involving an employee legal dispute. Continuing on this lifelong advocacy, Jeff currently serves as the esteemed political director for the Rebecca Project for Justice. Wow, Jeff, that's you and I have been friends for several years now, even before I relocated here to the DC area. And some of those things I actually did not know about you myself. But I am very proud to welcome you to this broadcast. Let's hop into this discussion. I'd like for you, to tell the audience and myself a little bit more about this $3 million arbitration. What happened? I think you're on mute. I can't hear you.
Okay.
There you go. Yep, there you go.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Zakiya, and thank you for reading my bio. Sometimes when I listen to it, I think about all the trials and tribulations I went through to be able to put some of that on paper. And one of the things that I'm thankful for is what's not included in the paper. I've had the blessing to be able to minister to the U.S. Senate for a number of years through the U.S. Senate Chaplain's Office, um, and that was as an extension of my ministry, which I started divinity school, I think, in about the year 1998, after I graduated from Trinity in my master's program. So all of this is part of my ministry and my ministry of justice that I think God has somewhat called me to. So let's talk about the how I came to win the largest settlement in the history of arbitration in the district. Um, we had a chancellor named Michelle Reed that I think most of your listeners will probably be familiar with, who came into the District of Columbia schools, and she wanted to remove teachers. She told Congress she wanted to remove teachers. She told the business community she wanted to remove teachers. So she went about removing any teacher, regardless of how quality of the quality that they provided to the education of the students of the District of Columbia. She removed anyone who um, objected to her insane methods and whatever it was that she was talking about in education. And because of the collusion that was going on at the Washington Teachers Union at that particular time, um, they fired just hundreds of mostly black educators
Black teachers. We've been
in
hearing
the
about
Washington,
that.
D.C. public school system. And at this time, this was not only happening in Washington, D.C., this was going on nationally. It was happening in Chicago, it was happening in Oakland, it was happening in Houston, it was happening in Miami. So this was something that went national. And Michelle Reed and people like Kevin Shavers and others who had Adrian Fenty were working along with these groups.
And just so we're clear for the audience, Adrian Fenty is a former mayor of Washington,
Right.
D.C.
And Kevin Shavers,
Okay.
right? And Kevin Shavers was his boss at the D.C. City Council, where Kevin Shavers was the chair of the Education Committee, and it was and it still is an unseemly relationship that he has with Betsy DeVos. He was her general counsel at the American Federation of Children for years. He still may be. I'm not too sure, but we know about his role in Democrats for Education Reform. And what most people don't know is the district's national role in setting the tone all across the country for this type of education reform. And luckily, because of my background in theology, and my background in education, I knew a little bit more about standardized testing and what was going on with children. So some of the things that Michelle
Yeah,
Rhee and Kaya
yeah. Tell us
Henderson,
what you saw. I mean, this advent of, so I guess my question is, was there testing before Michelle Rhee? I'm assuming that kids had to take some
there
kind of
was no,
assessment.
yeah, we always had testing. There was no high stakes testing. You weren't using
Explain the
standardized
difference for our
tests.
listeners. Okay.
Okay. When you have standardized tests, what they do is they reveal certain, uh, basically, they just show you what zip codes children live in. That's all standardized tests do. They're completely worthless to use as a measurement of children's ability or aptitude. When you start using standardized tests to discuss aptitude, you're going back into the early 20th century eugenics, and that's
All
what
right, let's
that
get into it
and
then.
that was the territory that Michelle Reed was going. So I think for me in my journey, I remember Dr. Francis Cress Welsing when I was 9 years old, watching Tony Brown Journal debate Dr. William Shockley of Stanford University, who was a Nobel Prize winner, about eugenics when I was like 9 years old, and I was like, "Who's this sister with the big fro?" Debating this Nobel Prize winner, and she just made him look silly
She did.
because
That's on YouTube.
and
Anybody, just let the listeners know, you can just go Google Francis Cress Welsing, William Shockley, and you'll be very pleased at how the sister handled him.
yeah, and she was this famous psychiatrist in Washington D.C. who most people knew, and I never lost sight of that. And as a adult working at the D.C. City Council and doing the work that I was doing. I was in contact with Dr. Welsing, and I was always talking to her, and she, admired some of the things that I was doing, and I loved a lot of the things that she was doing. And she always told me when I was younger, one day you're going to be working on eugenics. And I was like, no. But she knew about the impact of early childhood education and eugenics a lot further than I did, paying attention to it at that particular moment. And also, what people don't realize, I went to school in Eastern North Carolina. Eastern North Carolina was the site of forced sterilization, one of the biggest forced sterilizations in this country. About 6,000 to 8,000 North Carolinian residents were forcefully sterilized, all the way up to probably somewhere in the 80s. Now, I know in Georgia right now with ICE and the Trump administration, that issue is still current, and that's
It's happening.
one of the things I work on the Rebecca Project that I'll speak about later. So let's go back to this Michelle Rhee and what happened in Washington, D.C. So Adrian Fenty comes in, decides he wants to be part of this reform movement, doesn't know much about it, signs on. And essentially what you had was groups like Eli Broad, billionaires, Eli Broad, Bill Gates, uh, and different billionaires who decided they wanted to make money off of charter schools, and they wanted to have their ideology pushed into the classroom. And so now you have this young mayor who doesn't know much about, who wants to make a name for himself. So he brings in this person, Michelle Rhee. She knows nothing about education. She lied about her resume. Everything from the beginning was a
I
fraud.
did not know that. She lied about her
She
resume.
lied about her resume, what happened in Baltimore schools, this little achievement that is almost spectacular to do. It is it is nearly impossible. I mean, it happens once in a while, and I know I've been able to do it, to take children multiple grade levels in one school year. I mean, you just have to be the most phenomenal teacher in the world to especially to take large numbers of children, multiple grade levels, in one school year. And she was claiming that was she was able to do that. And one of the reasons why I know how hard it is because I've done it, and I know
So,
how.
yeah, why don't you ground us in your experience as an actual educator? What grades did you teach?
Oh, I taught Head Start. I taught Head Start through third grade. I taught Head Start for 7 years in Washington, D.C. I taught kindergarten for a number of years. So I'm an early childhood educator, and that's sort of rare for a black male. And I did so well that I was appointed to about 3 DC City Council committees. I was on the facilities committee. And so I was always in contact with the legislators. I had all the superintendents come to my classroom, and my first year they put me into Project Zero, and I was recognized by Project Zero early on in my career. And so now you're talking about the DC City Council tried to put me on what was called, when the control board took over the city, the Emergency Board of Trustees, which supplanted the Board of Education in the city. The Washington Post had nominated me for the school board when I ran for school board. The city paper had nominated me for school board. So I was a celebrated teacher in the in Washington D.C. I was also an officer of the Washington's Teachers Union. And what we were at that particular time coming out of a huge scandal where the former president of the Washington Teacher Union had stole $5 million. I ran for treasurer when that was occurring. We told the members it took almost 2 years to get her completely investigated. I think she did about 5 or 6 years in jail, her and the other people that stole with her. And then the new president of the Washington Teachers Union, George Parker, came in. And George Parker was just as scandalous as the former president. And George Parker, immediately after signing a contract with Michelle Rhee, and he lost this election, he went to work for her. I mean, I don't even think it was a month or two later. And what we were trying to do was tell people, the national people like Randy Weingartner, that George at that particular time was colluding with Michelle Rhee against his own
Wait,
members.
hold on now. Wait, the union colluded
The union
from your,
colluded.
and this is a part
The
of your $3
Washington
million
Teachers Union,
settlement
yes,
that you were able to prove.
yes,
Wow, this is
yeah.
explosive stuff, and this has been written
So
about in the Washington Post. Your story.
yeah, my story has been printed twice by the Washington Post. I think twice
Wow.
by the Afro, WAMU, Channel 4, Channel 5, Channel 7. Most of Washington's media has gone nationally. It has been printed
Wow.
nationally because I won 10 years of back pay. I want you to hear this. I won 10 years of back pay. You will be hard pressed to find an arbitration case where somebody won 10 years of back pay. And remember, I wasn't, I was one of the best teachers in the city. So I was compensated at a level that was for one of the best. So 10 years ago, I was making $80,000. That was
You
10,
was making
11
$80,000 in DC as a kindergarten teacher?
as a
That's
kindergarten teacher,
crazy.
11 years ago. I mean, so maybe
Wow.
11, 12 years ago. So, that speaks to how the city fired me with no paperwork, no grounds. I had never had a complaint. Once again, I was a celebrated teacher. So they had no evidence and they dragged the case on. And then they actually appealed it one time to the Public Employee Relations Board here in the district, and they lost. And they still didn't bring me back and still didn't pay me. So that drew some more stories from the Washington Post and from others and other sources. And so, when you're going through this and you've gone from celebrated teacher to now being fired, nobody knows why you're fired. Your case isn't being brought up by the union. So what do you do?
The union did not. This is. I got you. Got to talk. The union did not fight for you.
The union did not fight for me for 7, 8 years.
That's important. That is important. I want people to hear that, because oftentimes, education is very political. You know that, Jeff. But we hear people oftentimes, say, we have to support our teachers, and usually that means we have to support the union. And what you're talking about is a similar experience that I had as a public employee. Although I was not a teacher, I worked for the state of Ohio. And I know that you, as an advocate, many times what you're describing happens in a number of our unions. And I think that is very unfortunate that we don't have these conversations when it comes to race and labor.
Right,
Because a
right.
lot of times the unions, if you have a Black advocate who is an employee, the unions will collude sometimes against the employee, which is illegal.
Oh,
I
it was
filed,
absolutely
it's
illegal. And
absolutely
it's
illegal.
still
You can't,
illegal.
you're a dues paying member. Can you lean into that a little bit more for our listeners?
Well, what most people don't realize is it was a three-way battle. So now you're fighting the school system, now you're fighting the city, and you're fighting your own union. And so what I had to do was to figure out a legal strategy to get around all three of those things. So it didn't matter how many people in the city knew me. It didn't matter how great you had taught. You still needed the union to file the correct paperwork so that you would be able to go forward with your case. The union at that particular time only filed the paperwork because they mistakenly believed that I could not sue and come after them. That was the only reason at that particular time, a few years ago, that they actually filed the paperwork. So if I won 3 years ago, I think it was 2018 when I actually won. So this is from 2009. So this is 9 years later. That means in 2010 I would have won, 2011 I would have won, 2012 I would have won, 2013, 2014, all the way up to 2018. I would have won that case if they had simply just filed. And the union did not do it. The union did not do it. And the city, and what I did was I made sure the city knew about this all along the way. Because what would happen is the city would say the union sat on your rights or you sat on your rights. But if the city knew that the union hadn't done what it's supposed to do, then the city was supposed to contact the union and try to resolve this case. Neither one of them happened. So that made the city still at fault. And that's what they failed to realize. I spent 2 years at Georgetown Law researching my own case, making sure that the legal precedent was put in place so that I could move forward. And, through the grace of God, I was able to, prevail and get the union to make a little bit of movement. And then, as they started seeing it. And then the other thing I think people would really understand about this case is even after I won, the union still tried to undercut me. They tried to settle the case. The case was worth, I think, about 3.4, 3.5 million dollars just on the face value of what I won through arbitration. The union tried to settle the case for 1.4 million after I won, after the school system had lost its right to appeal. After the city had lost its right to appeal, the union went and signed an agreement for 1.4 million, and tried to still cheat me almost out of $2 million. And I refused. The outcome of that was 8 months later, the union was awarded, I think, $315,000, the only case in the history of the union where they got legal fees. So the union made $315,000 off DC public schools. They could have done that with each and every one of those cases that Michelle Reed fired people. The Washington, D.C. school system was so scandalous under Michelle Reed and Kaya Henderson that they brought the teachers back that they fired with me. I wasn't the only teacher that they fired. And they got them to sign over their rights saying they wouldn't sue the city, and fired them, some of those teachers, again.
Wow. And you didn't take the
No, I
bait.
didn't take the
You
bait.
never,
Now,
you never, you
I
never
will
went.
share this little astonishing fact, even though the city still
Okay.
owes me the money for my retirement, which is, we'll work that out. We still have an arbitrator working that out. The school system went and fired me again. They went and fired me again 1 month before I could retire. So we could just do the whole thing all over again. And they're going to be just as equally liable as they was for paying me.
So this is a strategy, a legal strategy on their side to wear you out, really almost to kill you. I mean, because I remember, Jeff, and if you don't mind me sharing,
Go ahead.
my hats is off to you, because when I first moved here, I remember I came and picked you up, and I met you at Georgetown Law, and you
Yes.
sat down with a spread of books and you explained all of this to me. And you also explained the connection of what you had uncovered that this administration had been doing in education of Black children. And you made the connection to eugenics. And I remember being blown away, but I also remember being heartbroken, because at that time you really were down and out, because you were still fighting for your rights. You were still fighting for what you deserve legally, financially. And I remember just thinking to myself, I have so much respect for you, because you were still in that legal library, even though at that time I don't think you had very much money to your name, right?
I was living. I was living in the shelter across the street.
I wasn't going to share that part, but I'm glad you felt comfortable enough to be transparent with our
it
members.
was absolutely
These people forced you into homelessness.
These
Since
people
you
forced
shared
me
it,
into
let's go there.
homelessness. Yes.
They forced you into homelessness. Wait a minute, not just a regular Black educator. We got black educators are a minority in this country after Brown. We know that that's true. We know that Black male educators is even less, especially like you said, in early childhood. And I just have to say, as a mother of two Black children and my Black son, it was a Black male educator that saved his life in kindergarten when he had the experiences he did. Shout out to Elton Burris, who is still a teacher in Dayton Public Schools to this day. But he saved my son's life, and the way that he interacted in school by having him as a kindergarten teacher. So this is very personal to me as a racial justice and education justice advocate. And I want the listeners to know what you've really been through in fighting for not just yourself, but fighting for marginalized children. You taught in one of the quote unquote worst schools in DC.
Yes, absolutely. And
had
actually
high
several of the worst schools.
Absolutely. And then, but you had high academic achievement with the so-called worst kids. That's remarkable. That is absolutely
I had
remarkable.
3 straight valedictorians who had been in my class who graduated when they graduated high school. They was 3 straight students, and the only thing they had in common were they were my students when I had them in early childhood. But remember, it was known that I was a high quality teacher. It wasn't a surprise. So I had no marks against my record. There was nothing there. There is still nothing there. But the city of Washington, D.C. decided that they was going to do this education reform. They were being investigated by the FBI every time you turn around. They had what was called the blue scandal, where they tried to say that the students who hadn't actually been going to even to class or coming to school were all going to college. So they had just had scandal after scandal after scandal after scandal. But one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is I was, it was Jeremiah Wright and Jawanza Kajufu who got me to teach in the first place. During this time,
We have that in common.
yes, Cornell West, made sure, I attended Union, that I had opportunity to get back into Union Theological. The U.S. Senate chaplain was, helping and praying for me and talking to me and talking to senators. So the senators even wrote the mayor and let her know their displeasure with what was going on. But, the mayor of the District of Columbia is the mayor of the District of Columbia, and she's going to do what she want to do. And so all of this was going on simultaneously. So, there's still some more court to be fought and some more resolution to this case. I'd like that the U.S. Attorney's Office is taking a very hard look at the whole matter right now, because no one can understand how the city paid you this amount of money and you still have the right to go sue them again. I mean, and so, and that's what God can do, and that's what a lot of times people don't understand. That's what God can do, because, there were certain blessings that I received. Wow, like you said, when I met with you, I didn't even realize I was coming out of the law school at that time. But just my work at Georgetown Law School set me up to do the work that I'm doing right now for the Rebecca Project for Justice. I had 2 years to just hardcore go into looking at eugenics and education and looking at all the law books and all the books on eugenics that was in Georgetown Law School and up on the main campus at the bioethics library. They have a whole library that's dedicated to basically the study of systematic racism, eugenics, and social Darwinism up at the bioethics library on the first floor of Healy at Georgetown University. And
that's where you had me, was the bioethics library, and I was in there. My head was about to explode. I'm like, what are you talking about?
Well, it's an amazing site when you
You
go in
helped
there
me with it.
and you show people that, wait a minute, they got a whole section of books just on this subject alone. And when you start reading these things and you start realizing that this is a 100-year-old problem, now what we have in the White House is we have a person who tried to do eugenics on a international level, and that's Donald J. Trump. So you can go back and read articles that was in Saloon, articles that was in different magazines where people talk about Trump's eugenics. Just 2 weeks ago, Trump brought up this racehorse theory 2-3 weeks ago in Minnesota. So you had the Washington Post, you had Saloon, you had even Rolling Stones. So you got Miss Magazine and Teen Vogue writing articles about eugenics and Trump's beliefs in them. But eugenics didn't just come when Trump believed in it. It was being brought by the Obama administration. It was being brought into by the Bush administration. It hasn't stopped since the 1940s. So now what you have is you have a wall that comes from eugenic ideology that Trump tried to build in immigration. You have in education, you have enforced sterilization in Georgia. You have the Washington Post talking about how it affects welfare. You have the Washington Post writing articles about conservation and eugenics. You got the Washington Post talking about homophobic and eugenics. And you even had Planned Parenthood at this particular time having to take Margaret Sanger name off of their
I saw that in New York.
right.
They finally disavowed her.
Finally admitted it.
They finally disavowed her after all these years.
So, we also had someone who just won Congress named Jamal Bowman. And I had met Jamal in the movement. And matter of fact, Jamal did part of his dissertation on eugenics in education. He just won Congress up in New York. I'm not exactly what particular seat. So we look forward to him, taking a look at this whole matter once he gets inaugurated in January. And so what most people don't understand is it's not only white supremacists who support eugenics, it's Black folks.
That's sad.
It's Black folks also, and that has been the case since the 1920s.
Since the beginning,
right?
I don't know if you want to. I don't want to know if you want to raise it up, but I believe the NAACP was one of the early supporters
of eugenics. That's how they funded. Actually, that's how they funded their lynching campaign. So they had the Fitter Family Contest. They used to have the beauty contest. The Miss America contest was a eugenic competition. So when people look all this up, and if you look at PBS did a very good special on eugenics about 2 years ago in 2018. There's a documentary now that was done by the University of Pennsylvania called The Dangerous Idea in 2016 and the Constitution Center. And Joe Biden was the actual president of that Constitution Center for a number of years. So he's president emeritus. And I actually had the opportunity to have one of my friends, Dr. Denisha Jones, ask Joe Biden on MSNBC, what did he think about?
I was at that, yeah.
What did he think about eugenics and education? And she boldly stood up there and asked him, and Joe Biden committed to taking eugenics out of standardized testing, to get rid of standardized testing. But we will have to see, what happens. So now you got Valerie Strauss from the Washington Post writing regularly about eugenics and education. You even got, you even have Diane Radovich, who was the author of some of this, now coming against eugenics.
She completely then flipped.
180.
She was one of the beginning people who was pushing a lot of this back when she was Secretary of Education under Bush. I have to go on record to tell you, Jeff, I do not trust her, and I don't care who knows it. I don't trust her.
The thing I found out in
the reason why I don't trust her, because she was such a vocal and a very strategic opponent of Dr. Adelaide Sanford.
Yes,
when she was on the New York Board of Regents against African-centered education for Black children and brown children. And she was also just against, even at that time, like she's come around on multicultural education, but she's still against African-centered education. And she made some very racist comments during that battle with Dr. Adelaide Sanford when she was on the New York Board of Regents. And Dr. Adelaide Sanford, there's an interesting YouTube video out there. She goes into great detail about how horrible Diane Ravitch treated her and the Black community in New York. So I will never forgive her for that.
Well, sometimes I think people have different misunderstandings about forgiveness. There's God's forgiveness, and then there's what the Bible calls forgiveness in some areas. And people change, and people, sometimes, especially later on in life, people have a chance to go back and look at the totality.
She's never apologized for that part, though.
Well, only thing I could share is she spent, and I'm not defending her earlier work by no means, but she has spent an enormous amount of her later years trying to right some of the wrongs, as opposed to other people. I know just recently, when it comes to Woodrow Wilson was a virulent racist.
Oh, absolutely. They just took his name down at Princeton, right?
Genesis. We still have
he was in Genesis,
of the local high school in Washington, D.C. So I know a committee that was appointed by the mayor, one name that came up with Alexander Graham Bell. They wanted to change the name of Alexander Graham Bell because his connection with eugenics. But in the District of Columbia, you not only have Alexander Graham Bell, you got Frank W. Ballou, you got Calvin Coolidge, you got Theodore Roosevelt. All of them were connected to eugenics. Every last one of them. I mean, it's almost every high school in the District of Columbia is named after, some connection to or eugenics. So there's a lot of more work to still be done. But it's discouraging. One thing that is discouraging is to hear Black DC City Council members walking around talking about standardized testing and achievement gap. Achievement gap is a racist concept. I mean, you can get on your phone right now and Google achievement gap.
Yeah, it is a racist concept. I think we agree there.
People like Ibram Kendi, scholars like Michelle Goodwin, scholars like Dr. Chantella Sherman. It's not a secret, So to be in 2020 and still have Black legislators talking about achievement gap is absolutely insane. So you wonder how, on a national level, you would get somebody like Donald J. Trump as the president of the United States. And one of the reasons is because in the Black community, you're already doing some of this to yourself. So we need to go through carefully and take a scalpel and look at some of the white supremacy practices that we have indoctrinated into ourselves. Some of the miseducation of the Negro that Carter G. Woodson was talking about.
That's right.
And go back and look at some of this old 100-year-old stuff. people wonder why gentrification, which is actually Black displacement, which is
It
another
is.
eugenic policy,
It
is so
is. Please
strong.
connect that to education, because we're
It's
talking about that as a team from a social determinants of health perspective. We've had virtual town halls on that, and housing, particularly in DC, is is critical and very much connected to displacement. As you know, Dr. Chikia Kua's sister, Leslie Fenwick, Dr.
yes,
Leslie
oh,
Fenwick at
absolutely.
Howard University,
Hmm.
she wrote an article, and it was also in the Washington Post, that made the connection between how Black people are currently being displaced and land and schools.
Well,
Do you
when you
remember
look at
that? And can you talk
right,
about that a little bit?
when you look at the charter school movement, which started off as a racist movement in Mississippi, in segregationist Mississippi. When you look at the fact that the district has more charter schools than any other place in the country outside of New Orleans, and the only reason New Orleans has so many charter schools was because of Hurricane Katrina. So Hurricane Katrina wiped out pretty much the New Orleans school system, and they replaced it with this racial segregationist charter schools. So when you look at how charter schools are serving in the Black community, even the NAACP had to do a moratorium. They did not completely stop saying that we need to do charters, but
And I
they,
think,
they
and to be
go ahead.
clear, I want to make sure we have a balanced conversation on charter schools. And I don't know, because I know we talked about this in our prep. I don't know if you had an opportunity to look into Margaret Fortune schools in
Yes, I
California.
did in California,
The the
absolutely.
the other thing is that I also know of friends, close friends of mine who live in DC, who have put their children through charter schools because for them it was a better option than the current public schools where they live. The other thing is there are several African-centered charter schools
Yes.
that I know that I support personally in DC because of how they educate the children, and it's not necessarily connected to these big box eugenic, whatever you want to. I
Right.
don't know which ones you're talking about, like the big chain ones. But I believe we do need to make a very important distinction, especially since I have to say this because when I think about Dr. Carol Lee, of course, Afisha
Mhm.
Matabuti, and Dr. Hakeem Matabuti out of Chicago, they have been running an African Center charter school for a very long time. Before that, it was a private school, but they were able to serve more children when charter schools became available, because charter
Well,
schools, Jeff, are public schools.
Well, let me say this, and we have a little disagreement about that part. Let me say this: when I ran for school board back in 1996, I was a supporter of highly functioning charter schools, high quality charter schools. That's what I'm talking about. Is the difference. What you have is a charter school model that basically is worse than the public schools, and essentially what they do in the District of Columbia is
That's
they
true for
get the
Dayton.
money. They get the money after what we call the count, after they find out how many students you have, the tax dollars, and once they receive the tax dollars for the students, they systematically push the students out. So that's the push out that you have scholars talking about today, about what's going on. But the money stays with the charter school. So
That's a problem. That is true.
who wouldn't invest in a non-accountability system like that? So you have poorly functioning charter schools. I'm not talking about the highly functioning charter schools that a lot of the African-centered schools are. I'm talking about the poorly functioning charter schools around the country that close, and the students are just lost without 2, 3, 4, 5 years worth of education, and then they're pushed into the criminal justice system. So that has to be worked on, and that's a responsibility of the Republicans and the Democrats. And you got to remember, the teachers all across the country, the Black teachers all across the country, who were fired in Chicago, who were fired in Houston, who were fired in Oakland, they had absolutely no allies. And I want
Even the
everybody to
union,
hear
I
this.
got to go back to this
Even
because
with the
now the
union,
unions want to act like they Black folks' friends. But when Black teachers were getting fired, where were they?
where were they? Why did my case take 9? I mean, you have to remember, Randy Weingartner knew about my case from day one. There was no question that I was fired for politics. There was nothing there. Even the arbitrator who looked at the information which the school system provided, and they said, even if it was true, it still wasn't grounds to be fired. I mean, and that's just amazing in itself. The school system in the District of Columbia provided absolutely no.
The
Uh,
fact the fact that you were fired lets me know it's political. Do you know how hard it is to fire a teacher in a union?
Well, I mean, it's absolutely amazing. And then they got charged with 4 counts of retaliation. And guess what they did? Went and did it again, even after they paid me. They went and did it again. So, that's the mentality of the people that we're dealing with. That's the
These are the
corruption.
political consequences of also being a Black teacher that's truly for children. We haven't said that, Jeff.
Oh, for
You
sure. I
have
mean,
you were an educator, and I need to say this. My mother-in-law knows you, and I remember when we having a conversation with you whether or not you would be working, helping us with
with
our
the daughter,
daughter.
yes.
And
Hmm.
we talked to my mother-in-law about it. And for the listeners, my mother-in-law is also a former educator. She just retired last year. She taught in DC public schools for about 15 years before moving out to Prince George's County. And my mother-in-law spoke very highly of you, Jeff. Your work. She said, this is verbatim what my mother-in-law said. She said, he's for the kids. And the fact that she said that was indicative that to her, not all of her colleagues were for the kids.
Right.
Right?
Well, unfortunately, in the public sphere, we're going to have some people who may have started out maybe more stronger, uh, trying to direct their energy toward helping children, and some kind of way fail by the wayside. You have some of that in every profession, whether it's lawyers, whether it's accountants, whether it's dentists, whether it's medical doctors. Some people start off that way, and that we can't necessarily control. But to create a whole system.
But the fact that those teachers are still teaching and you're not is a problem. And that is something that we need to be organizing to control. Because especially when
Well,
they're teaching Black children and we talking about an achievement gap, we're not having a full conversation if we're talking about educators who are not actually educating children because they fell off or whatever.
what
And
we're
this is
talking
not
about.
an indictment against all teachers. I just want to center the fact that here you are, were a highly qualified teacher. You have all these awards set on all these committees, and you were fired
Well,
in
that
a
happens.
union
I mean,
without union
if
protection.
you go back in the history of Black intellectual, you'll find out that Ida B. Wells was fired as a teacher. You'll find out that the best teacher, W. Du Bois, couldn't get her job. That's why he was with the Crisis magazine. He was the most celebrated individual, one of the most celebrated individuals, intellectuals of his time. You'll find out that most quality Black teachers end up on the unemployment line at some particular point, because you're going against a
Damn.
countercultural, against a system of white supremacy. And that is what, and we have way too many people who are, well, as Martin Luther King said, well adjusted to maladjustments, who are actually teaching our kids. And so in the classroom, you're either one or two things. You're either an liberator or you're an oppressor. And it ain't no in between. And be
That's
very
LaRon
clear.
Bennett's quote. Let's give him
you
credit.
know,
That's what LaRon Bennett
and
said.
like Dr. Amos Wilson said, America educates its Black children to ignorance. And
That's
let's
right.
be very clear on that. And most of what I did in the classroom was not prescribed by DC public schools. It was things I
There it
learned in the
is.
church. It was things I learned in the family. It was things I already knew how to do, just growing up in a powerful Black family. So most of that came from within. And it did not have to do with the curriculum of DC public schools. It was something that God gifted me and granted me the ability to work and try to uplift and try to help others. And when you bring that particular energy and you still work within the system, you can fall to the side. But what people need to know is that God got you. And that's the thing, and that's the message that I wanted people to know. Regardless of the trials and tribulations and everything that this particular school system or this particular local government or this particular national government tried to do to me, I still prevail. I still rise. I still
That's a
stand.
powerful
And,
message.
and,
I
and see,
appreciate
and
you bringing
that's
in your faith.
and same thing for the people who, and I want to talk about even in forced sterilization. Sometimes when I'm working on eugenics, I was forced. I had the opportunity to work on the 2016 treatment of certain payments bill, and what that did was that provided money for people who were forcibly sterilized in the
Wow.
states of Virginia and North Carolina. Those are the only two states right now. We're waiting for Kamala Harris to join the effort in California. There's a forced sterilization compensation bill out in California right now.
Oh, I
I think
did
it's
not
bill,
know that.
yeah,
Okay.
I think it's
You
bill
teaching today.
1186. Yeah, that's been out there. So we're trying, and I have no qualms with Kamala, somebody I met in undergrad. As far as her providing access to meet with her staff and to work with her staff. And the only thing that actually stopped me from working with her staff was COVID. So it's a little challenging right now with
Yeah.
COVID and getting an
And
appointment.
she's running for vice president. So
And she's running for vice president of the United States, but she could turn out and, like I said, turn around like Diane Radovich. Some of the racial mass incarceration things she did in California, people
and the way that she criminalized
we are
Black
not happy
parents.
with.
Yeah, no, we weren't
Clearly not
happy with
happy
those truancy prosecutions of
with those
Black parents
truancy
either. Yeah,
prosecutions and other that. But she could turn around.
right.
We don't know at the end of the day what God is going to do before we end up in our final resting places. I just wanted to know while I have the breath of life in me, that I'm
Right.
speaking it into such a way that it's going to pour onto others so that
Yeah.
they can continuously build themselves and build their communities and build their families. That's the direction we got to go, like Dr. Amos Wilson, like W. Du Bois, like Malcolm X, and like so many else, and like so many of the powerful women that came before us, like Ida B. Wells,
Yeah,
and
she's one of my sheroes. Fannie Lou Hamer is
Fannie Lou
also
Hamer,
another shero, and she was sterilized
another
in Mississippi.
another zero,
She
another
she
zero, and
she
most
was
people don't
sterilized.
know she was sterilized. It was
Yep.
called the Mississippi Actindectomy. Like
Yep.
most people, and we probably gonna have to talk about this again, but most people don't even realize the Tuskegee experiments are called the eugenic Tuskegee experiments. This was done in 6 places in the South. It wasn't just in Tuskegee. So these experiments came out of the University of Virginia. The scientists that did this came out of the University of Virginia. You can go back and check with Dr. Preston Reynolds at the University of Virginia and go back and find these facts out. You can read Dr.
Please give us some
Chantel Sherman.
resources. You got some books to show the audience,
Yeah,
references?
actually, I do. This is one of them right here. This is a book by Stephen Selden. It's called Inheriting
Inheriting
Shame. I don't know
Shame.
if
Yeah, we
Inheriting
can see
Shame,
it.
people want to
Inheriting
find out
Shame,
about it.
the
Inheriting
story of
Shame
eugenics and racism in
in
America.
America. This is a
Inheriting
good book to
Shame.
understand education. Um, a new book that Oprah, actually talked about, Cast. If you look
Yes.
right, if you look right here in Cast, it talks extensively about eugenics. If you go to Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, he talks extensively about eugenics. And this particular book, if you go to Angela Santini and her book Superior, you can go to Dr. Chantella Sherman's book, In Search of Purity.
I have that
Uh,
book. You recommended that book to me, and I
yes,
actually have a
and,
signed
and, and,
copy
and Dr.
from
Chantella
Chantella
Sherman,
Sherman.
let me just say she has been a true blessing to me and helping my research and helping my work go forward. I was taking Dr. Cornell West, as I said earlier, a few years ago, and I started challenging him with Dr. Chantella Sherman's work, and he was just absolutely blown away how
Like I
magnificent
was.
a
I was
scholar.
blown away when you started teaching me about it.
Yeah. I mean, so that's
This
the
is stuff
sister,
that
and she's
this is
local.
stuff that's
And she's
frustrating
a
because our
DC public
media.
school graduate too. I want everybody to know that she
Yeah.
graduated from Wilson High School.
Yeah. No, these are things that are kind of frustrating because they're not necessarily widely in the public lexicon. We
Mm-hmm.
don't talk about these things, but they're very much still very present, like you mentioned, in education. And you made the connection between standardized testing and that being a continuation of eugenics in education. I feel like we're definitely going to have to bring you back on, but I did have a question from the audience, and I believe it's from the sister that's currently running for DC school board, Sister LaJoy, I believe, who was joining.
Okay.
Her question is, number one, this was several minutes ago, she was acknowledging the fact that you have sacrificed a lot for the community. You've sacrificed a lot for the children of DC. And she wants to know, what advice would you give advocates fighting the inequities in the system today?
Well, one of the biggest things with the advocate community is The advocate community is in Washington D.C. is like a little corporation, too tied to too many of the city council members, too
Yeah.
tied to the power levels in the city. Um, as a parent, and I think LaJoy is a parent of a child with disabilities.
Yes.
She needs to, well, she gets an opportunity to challenge some of the people who are right around her as far as their advocacy and what they're actually doing, and what they're actually saying. There is no reason for in the District of Columbia to have 13 council members who can't understand that standardized testing comes directly from eugenics. I mean, recently the DC chair of the DC City Council member Phil Mendelssohn, uh, actually said some ridiculous stuff about Woodrow Wilson. Even Princeton took his name down. I mean, it's absolutely absurd, some of the comments that you hear. And parents are going to have to push harder.
Yeah.
They're going to have to file lawsuits. They're going to
Yeah.
just have to take people to court. And that's what I highly recommend. If I had a child with disabilities, I would be taking District of Columbia to court. They have absolutely no argument to explain what they're doing in education. It is absolutely insane. And so, and we have to challenge our politicians.
Yeah.
I know one of my council members, Trayon White, has talked about
Yeah. Trayon. Yeah.
has talked about introducing legislation. He's talked about introducing legislation. Trayon been on the city council now for 4 years, going into his second term. We want to see that legislation. We want to see city council members asking questions about white supremacy and what we're doing institutionally in the District of Columbia. And it is insane that the District of Columbia is leading the nation in this charge instead of leading the nation against white supremacy. I mean, that is insane. So how do we get to this particular place? So I wish Miss Law well in her campaign. She knows I'm a supporter of Dr. Carlene Reed. But as a parent, I wish her and her daughter the absolute
Yeah.
best. And I've heard some absolutely wonderful things about this particular woman. But I think once again that Dr. Carlene Reed is someone who I've known for quite a while, and she's an outstanding educator also. So Ward 8 is going to end up with two people who have a remarkable heart for the community. And but as an advocate, it takes years. And then the other thing, it takes years to learn some of this stuff. I
Yeah.
mean,
You got that right.
I used to argue, with Dr. Wells and some of the, and I used to say, and I would tell her, I was like, look, I don't want to spend no time trying to explain some of this stuff to our folks, because when they get stuck on something, they just sometimes get stuck on it. And you're trying to tell them that even a standardized test, you don't have to take a standardized test.
Wow.
We've had hundreds of thousands of people all across the country opt out and not allow their children to take standardized tests because some people know what the standardized test represents.
Let me ask you something in terms of, and I asked Dr. Ivory Tolson when we had him on a couple of weeks ago, because he also said some similar things in terms of tests maybe not being the best tool to measure what a young person is learning or measure growth. Do you have for people who are saying, well, how do we hold educators accountable? How the hell will we know if the children are learning any damn thing if we don't use a test? What should we use? If for people who will say,
You can use your eyesight. You can use a portfolio. You can use um, uh, 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 16 to almost 48 different measures to find out how well children are progressing through their academic performance. Standardized test is just one. Standardized test is just one. There are about 48 different measures that you can use to find out how well the children are doing. You can make them do a project. I mean, you can talk to students. It doesn't take long to figure out who's a high achiever and who's not a high achiever in academia. That isn't. And then what it is that we call academia, making it more balanced, where it's not a reflection upon white supremacy, that is not a reflection of our white society, that children are learning in their community about things that are applicable to them. And, because and then vocational education
So
is
one of the
important
things I
once again.
pushed, so
Yes.
that was his
Mhm.
answer too. And not to cut you off, but
Mhm.
I want to make sure that I bring this in because this is really critically important. Um, so Dr. Tolson said the same thing, and I said, well, that's not going to work if you got a child who want to go to, say, medical school. There's a test you have to take before you get into medical school.
Well,
That's not going to work for a child that wants to go to law school.
let me jump in
There's
here.
a
I have to
test.
jump in here on this point. There wasn't a medical test before. There was only a medical test when large numbers of blacks started going to medical schools. That's
Wow.
when they created the test for the law school and for the medical school. You
Are
were
you
an
serious?
apprentice.
I've never heard nobody say
Yes.
that.
Yes. You
Wow.
were an apprentice. You were an apprentice as a medical doctor. You became an apprentice. There was no test. Nor for legal. There was no bar examination. Those examinations only came into place in the beginning of the 20th century when large number of blacks decided they wanted to be doctors and lawyers. There is a report. I can't remember the name of the individual right now. And what they did was they shut down all the medical schools outside of Howard and Fisk to make sure that they can try to control the curriculum so that medical doctors did not teach and heal people in particular ways in this community. Excuse me for my mind right now.
It's all
But
good. You
if you
teaching.
go back and look at this particular doctor, he was a eugenicist. This was done by the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement was like a religion for the first 40 years of the 20th century. So if you go back and you look at Plessy versus Ferguson, you go back and look at Skinner versus Oklahoma, you go back and look at Buck versus Bell, you go back and look at the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, you go back and look at all of this legislation. It deals specifically with white supremacy, eugenics, and bestiality of how we view blacks in the beginning of the late 19th, early 20th century. And so this was done, some people call it social Darwinism. Some people call it, institutionalized racism. But it's the same strand. The only thing they did was change the clothes of the legislation that they proposed. And so it's sort of disingenuous, especially in Washington, D.C., for some of the council members to try to ignore the significant history. And it wouldn't be so bad if the history wasn't so easily found. The District of City Council is only 2 blocks away from the Jewish Holocaust Museum. And they used this same ideology to kill 6 million Jews in America. The same ideology that the District of Columbia City Council members are reintroducing into public education and then calling it corporate school reform. I mean, it is the height of insanity. Anybody, and like I said, anybody who wants to research it, talk to scholars, and go back. Even in California, our friend Deborah Watson, in California, a 7th grader did a book report, a 7th grader, and they had to change the name of 3 schools in his school district. Right now, I think last week, they took the name off of David Starr Jordan off of Indiana University and at Stanford University. He was one of, because of his connection with eugenics. So I know at the University of Maine, the University of Minnesota, at Harvard University, University of Princeton, all the universities all across the country are looking at these eugenicists and removing their name. What is it that we are doing in the District of Columbia?
So this is mind blowing, right? And I know we got to wrap. We're almost at time. I want to give you an opportunity. So this was a lot. That's why I say we're going to have to come back and really have. I think it's going to be good, if you actually do almost like a presentation, Jeff, because the comments are live. People are like, okay, where can I know more about this? You made some references.
Mm-hmm. I would love for you to come back, and I would love to come back, and I would also love for you to have my sweet friend, Dr. Shantella Sherman,
I would want both of you all to come back. That would be great, because I think this is something critical, especially because it is related to education. It's something that's ongoing. A lot of people don't know that Stanford University, a lot of the Ivy Leagues, was the brainchild of eugenics.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And so people are so excited. I see Black people be like, "Oh, my child got into Harvard," and all this other. So we just need to have a larger conversation. It would be great. We can do it as a presentation style because I think there's a lot of interest. We had a lot of people really stay on for the whole program, Jeff. There's a lot of comments. Some of your cheerleaders are in the
when
comments.
you're talking about COVID-19 and herd immunity, most people don't even understand that herd immunity is a eugenic concept.
Lord have mercy. I didn't know that.
So when you start talking about immunizations, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, 1905, I mean, the one thing I can say is if you don't know how to pray, when you get to studying eugenics, you're going to learn how to pray. I mean, I had, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, I just learned that her first case in front of the Supreme Court was fighting for those North Carolina eugenic sterilization victims.
Appreciate her.
The Cox case. And I had a chance to talk to Ms. Cox last week. And I had to do about 3 days worth of therapy after I talked to her.
Wow.
So you got to remember that the executive director of the Rebecca Project for Justice is a woman named Elaine Riddick. And I want everyone to Google her story and find out how powerful her story is.
I'm familiar with her.
Elaine, and I talk to Elaine every day, bless her heart, and I hope she's watching today. You know, to find out the injustice that was done to these women. I mean, they took away these women's rights to have children for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
Sterilize them. And it's still going on today through the Trump administration, through ICE facilities.
It's terrible.
Yes.
And the media has talked about, thankfully, they have talked about the sterilizations, but they don't use the language eugenics. And I think that's why people don't connect.
Some don't.
Like
some have.
Some have. You're right. But at least in the broadcast media, I haven't seen them use that term. They may have. I don't have television. I use streaming services. So like, if you know what I mean. So you're right. But we do have to wrap. We're at an hour. The show is an hour, but you have my promise to bring you back again. When you come back, Dr. Chantella Sherman can join us. We really do need a presentation style, and you and I can work offline to really prep that because your sister Carlene commented and said we need a reading list, right? So there are people who really want to dig into this topic. There are people that really. Jeff, this was amazing. I so appreciate you. I just want the world to know that I'm grateful for you. You are an amazing teacher. I thank you for still having the strength to push through, fight for yourself, and fight for the rights of all the children in DC public schools. We thank you, and we'll be looking forward to having you back again very soon. Take good care.